That is a very difficult question. I think what you're asking is, who am I having a conversation with in the last 14 years?
Yes.
As these stories have been written over, longer than a decade now. And conversation partners change sometimes. One day you're in conversation with Montaigne and the next day with Tolstoy. But with short stories, I think you may have noticed these short stories, they're, even though they've been written in 14 years, I think they're consistent in a way, because partly I think my major conversation partner in writing stories is William Trevor. And I looked up, his work. When I write stories, I read his stories. And another prominent conversation partner during these years is Mavis Galland, the very wonderful, prickly Mavis Galland, especially her longer stories, her novellas. And I think there is, in the middle of this collection, there's a centerpiece of a novella. And that novella was written while I was reading Mavis Galland's work. So I would say Mavis Galland and William Trevor, and to a lesser degree, Elizabeth Bowen were there too in this book.
Now, is there a common thread that you can see between William Trevor, Mavis Galland, and Elizabeth Bowen? Like, is there something about their work that resonates with you that you think their work has in common?
Right. I think, if I can, I'm sure this is a very generalized answer. I think they are the kind of writers who are not really creating characters rather than finding characters. And it's a big thing for me. I think sometimes you get asked about how did you create that character, as though a character was something you made out of nothing. And it's never that for me, and I don't think it's that for Trevor or Mavis Galland or Bowen. Mostly these characters exist in the world. They're living their own lives. They're, minding their own business. And the writer's job is to sort of run into them and see something strange about them and discover them. And then, discover them in a way is writing their stories as a way to discover them. So I never think about a character created by Mavis Galland or a character created by William Trevor. I always think they're the characters saved from oblivion or from people's inattention by these writers.
Okay, so just to clarify, when you say that you're finding these characters and that these writers that you admire are finding these characters, do you mean finding them in real life and then creating them from people that they've interacted with in real life, or do you mean finding them like in the ether?
Finding them in the ether, but maybe with sort of, the characters are like kites. They always have a line, a thread, connected them to reality. Sometimes it's just, it's just a glimpse of someone. I remember meeting William Trevor for the first time. We were having lunch, and a woman walked past the patio and in an orange blouse, very, very striking color. And Trevor said, "Look at that woman. What an interesting woman." What an interesting woman is he saw her rather than she was interesting. So I feel that when I say finding characters, it's either just a glimpse of them in real life or just they leave you in a kind of trance. They leave you in a kind of mood, and that's how you find them.
So you'll be, just so people listening, especially writerly people listening, will get a better understanding of how you do this. I think it's easier to discern how you might be out and about. You're at the grocery store, and some man walks past, and he's holding I don't know, like some sort of animal. I don't know why I was imagining a pig. I guess people have pet pigs, but just some striking situation. You see him in passing, and then that guy ends up in one of your fictions. I think most people can understand that pretty clearly. Where it gets a little bit trickier is to understand how, for example, you might pull one of these characters from your imagination, or how they might occur to you, like just sitting in front of your desk or washing dishes or something.
Right. So if I can give you an example, that's a very good question. Some of the characters are actually, from the collection. They were not characters I discovered in real life, but in my imagination. There's a story called A Sheltered Woman in the collection. And it's about a Chinese lady who is a nanny. At the beginning of the story, she bought 2 notebooks in a garage sale. She bought 1 notebook. It's 5 cents. She bought 5 cents a notebook. And she was thinking, if only there's another notebook, she can buy 2 with a dime. That's a great deal. That thing really happened in my head rather than there was a real woman at a garage sale I saw. It was because I bought a notebook years ago when I first came to America. I bought a notebook, actually 5 cents, at a garage sale. I never used it. And one day I saw the notebook. I thought, oh, I never used it. It's a 5 cents notebook. And then this someone is not me, because I know it's not me. Someone said in my head, well, if only there were 2, so I would get 2, with a dime. That's a better deal. And then that someone kept on. She went on to say, but how much life do you have to be recorded in 2 notebooks? Not enough life to be in 1 notebook. I was fascinated when I heard that voice. So I thought, well, that's my character there.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, the question that occurs to me is, I know writers will hear those voices, sometimes anyway. Most people probably wouldn't. And the question I have is whether or not characters are visiting all of us, and it's only writerly people who are hearing it. Do you know what I'm saying? What's your theory on that? Or are characters only visiting writers?
I'm sure characters visit us all democratically all the time. I strongly believe in democracy in that way. I think writers may be trained to pay a little closer attention to these fleeting moments. These moments are all quick and fleeting, and if you don't catch it right away, it's gone. And so maybe writers are just better trained at catching those little moments.
You have to be paying attention to your mind, and you have to have some remove from it. It's very easy, I think, to get lost in the static of one's thoughts and in the static of just everyday life. Mm. And it seems like you have to be operating at some degree of calm in order to notice the fact that this voice, like you say, it happens quickly, occurs to you, and to see it for what it is.
Right. But sometimes you missed it, or sometimes you catch it for a moment and you say, I'm going to come back and think about it. When you come back, that thing is gone. I've noticed that.
Or you forget.
You forget, yeah, it's not always there. So I always have multiple notebooks. Just something happens right away, put it in the notebook.
That's what you do? Mm-hmm. You keep one on your person? Like you have one in your pocket or your bag or something?
I have 2 in my bags, and I have maybe 5 on my desk.
And you're keeping notes?
I do keep notes. Sometimes it's so fast you have to type the notes on the phone. I hate to type on the phone, but I have notes typed on my phone too. But mostly just write it down right away. And
what's the hit rate? Like you maybe write these things down, 1 out of 10 actually becomes a story, or is it higher than that? Oh, it's higher than I probably have thousands of notes that are going nowhere. Oh, so it's worse. The hit rate is like hit rate. That's right. Less than a percent. Right. That's right. You're talking about hit rate. I was thinking about creation. These notes. Yes, I have tons of notes. Not everything goes to a story. So what do you know? What is the determining factor? Like, why is it just that it's just stickier? You keep ruminating on it, or it keeps emerging and becoming more and more dimensional in your mind? Like, what is it that separates the notes that do become stories from the ones that don't?
I think something, if you remember, in 6 months, many of these stories have taken me, months to write, or sometimes a year or two. I think if you have a thought, and after 6 months, the thought is still there, as you said, sticking, or just being more baffling. I think I write out of bafflement. So the thing is becoming curiouser and curiouser, and then you think there's something there. And there are, other times I would, write a clever note. I thought, well, this will become a story. 6 months later, it's flat. There's nothing there.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I think part of the writer's skill, I mean, it requires a lot, but I think earlier in my life, I might have been like, well, you just have to be really good at sentence making. And that is part of it. But you also have to be really good at being patient, for one. Like sometimes when you give it 6 months, you realize that this thing you were in love with on the day that you wrote it is totally flat and useless. And then this thing that might not have shown much promise at all when you wrote it down might become the thing that within a few weeks or months is the one that you can't shake and becomes a story. And maybe, and you can agree or disagree, as you go further and further along in your career, you get better at parsing that stuff or learning which thoughts to trust or when, which instincts, are the ones to pay attention to. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. I also think, sometimes I don't always think of this way, but sometimes I look at all these, moments of instinct. I think what you said, patience, that's the most important thing. Is do you have the patience to follow up with that instinct? The first layer actually is not that interesting. You have to go another layer underneath. Actually, it's not that interesting either. You really have to have the patience or the time or sort of the curiosity to follow up several steps further. And then you hit something interesting. And that is the beginning of a story, rather than the very first layer, that first glimpse or first impression. I do think now I know it feels odd to say, there's no road there, but there's something you can just follow, and you will find the road there or the path there. So now I have a little bit more patience just following through. I think it's easier to have a thought. We all have thoughts all the time. It's harder to think through a thought. And I think thinking through is possibly the most important thing I've learned from writing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I kind of feel the same way. And I think the patience issue, too, for me, has to do with learning how to live through a bad day, where maybe the thought is whatever you need is resisting you. The work is resisting you. You can't find your way to that next layer. And I think maybe earlier on that could defeat me or be more demoralizing than it has become. I've learned to just live to see another day,
Right.
and it's I think one of the more interesting things is the way that a piece of fiction can feel like it isn't coming together. You can have a really terrible day with it, but then the very next day can be completely different.
That's right. It's like weather. Sometimes the weather is just perfect. Sometimes the weather is just crappy, right?
Right. You learn to sit through it.
Yes.
Well, I want to talk to you about the themes that work in this collection and how these stories involve things like loss, absence, grief, estrangement, dislocation, like a lot of difficult human stuff. And we should talk at the top of the conversation about something that you yourself mentioned in the acknowledgments of this book, that over the 14 years, you mentioned that this collection was written over the course of 14 years, you have been through quite a lot of loss. You lost, in that time, your father, your teenage son, Vincent, your mentor, William Trevor, or is that right?
Yes.
And then a close friend as well. So that's a lot. And of course it would find its way into this work.
Right. I feel life really bleeds into work, in all sorts of ways. And I consider work as a sort of placeholder for life. Anything that happens in life finds a place in the work. So I think the good thing about the book, or the comforting thing about the book, is because it's written over 14 years, and I can see myself at different stages of those past 14 years in the book. And sort of I can remember how it felt then, but I am in another place or in another space now, if that makes sense.
Of course, yeah. I mean, these fictions that we create, they are little snapshots, right, of who we were when they were written, and it does change. It's interesting. I've had to get more comfortable with that. Sometimes I can look at old snapshots and be like, ugh. But, it's just who you were at that point.
Yes, it's yourself there, yes.
So when it comes to this issue of autobiography in writing, has your relationship to that part of it changed over the years? Like, have you always viewed the work that you create as autobiographical in nature? I know writers have different feelings about this, but you just said you could really see yourself in it. I could feel you in it, even though I don't know all the details. But is this how you conceive of your fiction?
No, actually, I still don't feel autobiographical, even though I can say on this page, that's me walking down the street thinking that thought. And I don't know why. I think, we writers probably are very self-delusional in that way. You can just tell yourself, this is not me. I'm writing a character. And that's all it takes. And I still think, well, it's my experience, but it's the character's story. It's not my story. And I don't view my life as a story or as a narrative. But I can give part of my experience to a character or to a set of characters, and then they can have those experiences to carry on as stories. So no, I think I don't make a distinction now as I used to be. I used to be so adamant. No, I'm not autobiographical. I only wrote about other people's experience. No, that's clearly a lie, right? So, but I don't claim to write autofiction or autobiographical fiction. Because after all, they're their stories. I've given some of my things to other people.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can have it both ways, I feel like, with this. Like, yes, these are fictions, these are characters, they are separate from you. And yes, it's autobiographical, and it's definitely you in there.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So one of the things I noticed about these stories is that most, if not all of them, feel like they are happening in the aftermath of something. Right. There's like a wonderful interiority to your fiction, like an incredibly astute understanding of these characters and the way that their minds work and the way that they emote or not. Some of them
or not is important.
Or not, yeah. I mean, so it's not always somebody like lashing out or speaking out or acting out. A lot of times it's what they don't say that's the most powerful, and the ways in which they are restrained in their responses to the circumstances of their lives, circumstances which are often very difficult. And I just want to hear you talk about that similarity, like if it was something that was intentional or something that just emerged, like these characters kind of come to you, as we've discussed, in their various ways. Did you ever think to yourself intentionally, like, I want to write a collection where people are in the dealing with the aftermath of loss, or dealing with the aftermath of the dissolution of a relationship? Do you know what I'm saying?
Right. No, I didn't start thinking that way, but I can see after writing for these years, one is, I'm sure I am drawn to certain characters, and the kind of characters who actually, to borrow that lovely phrase from Elizabeth Bowen, and she said certain characters live with the lid on rather than lid off. That concept of lid on, adding the pressure, the reticence, the stoicism, with the lid on. That, I think those kind of characters just are attractive to me because, as you said, they're not flailing around or they're not yelling or crying or screaming because they're holding their bodies still. But their minds are not still, and you want to look at their minds and see what kind of drama is, inside rather than outside. I'm just more interested in the internal, everything internal, I would say. I'm not an external writer. I don't see my characters doing things all the time, but they think all the time, and they contradict. I think it's easier to contradict yourself in thinking than in doing things, right? If you're walking west, all of a sudden you want to contradict yourself, you have to walk east.
Right.
The characters are sitting there. They're thinking this, no that, but this. So that kind of scenario just is attractive to me.
It also feels truer to life, at least for neurotic writerly people. Most of our lives are lived inside our heads.
Oh, yes. Very true.
That's where the action is. I mean, yeah, you go to the grocery store. Yeah, you go to work. Yeah, you do this, you do that. And these things are not without meaning or import. But what percentage of your day is spent lost in the yammering, judging, grieving, angry, ecstatic, unsatisfied voices of our head? You know what I'm saying? It's all there all the time. And I don't think I know I'm not conscious of it most of the time. Yeah, I try my best to get better at it, but it's hard.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah, and this is what you're mapping as a writer.
Yes, and that's where your material is, right?
Okay, so the question then I would pose to you is, how are you so good at it?
Thank you.
Because you are, like I said, very skilled at recreating in very specific ways that are specific to these very disparate characters, an interiority that feels so human and lived in and believable. I have to believe that you are paying attention to your mind in a regimented way, or does it all just come from reading? Maybe you're just picking it up from reading and other, I think we can maybe grab some of it that way as well. But can you just talk about the ways in which you've become adept at accessing this stuff?
Wow, that's okay. I've never been asked that question, and
I'll narrow it down.
Mm-hmm.
Are you a meditator? Are you somebody who really pays attention? Do you pay attention to your own thought processes? Are you quiet and really, you have to watch it in order to be able to get good at that music, I would imagine.
Yes. I'm not a meditator. I do pay very close attention to my thoughts in that, sometimes when you think, you don't think in language, right? It's a shortcut. You may just have a glimpse of something. I do have to capture that and put into language in my head. I have to put a full sentence there so I can process it. So I suppose if you are in my head, it's just a voice talking, and then okay, this is not the right word. Let's use another word. Let's revise this sentence. So it's a constant revision of a thought until I thought, wow, this is a good thought. Let me find a notebook and write it down. I think that's basically what I do all the time, just looking at the sentences in my head and say, is this a good sentence? Or is this only just a shortcut sentence?
Well, and I think, too, when you pay attention to your thoughts and you have these notebooks where you're writing things down, and like we discussed earlier, you'll think something's great and it turns out to not be so great, or something isn't so great, but then it turns out to be useful. Mm-hmm. You develop a healthy mistrust.
That is a very good phrase, healthy mistrust. Yes. You cannot take anything for granted, right?
Yeah, or take it too seriously.
Yes.
You know, you kind of got to give a pause. It's easy to get carried away. And I want to talk about this in particular with like the challenges that you have been through over the course of writing this. I think it, for anybody were to read the acknowledgments, just that line, this string of losses that you have suffered through. How do you carry on? Like how have you found ways to continue to move through life? Because I think your characters are doing that too. And it's what we all have to do, I think, if we live long enough. We are going to experience loss and these kinds of just big heartbreaks and things that stun us, maybe to degrees that they shouldn't. I don't know. It's easy for people to think that they should be, I don't know, like that they shouldn't have to deal with these things, right? But sometimes this stuff finds us in our lives and you have to keep going. Right. Like, how have you found the strength?
Reading, I think. And reading and writing. When I say writing, it doesn't mean writing stories or writing essays. And sometimes I just copy people's work into my notebook. I speak about notebook. I have multiple notebooks. I have one notebook where I just copy Shakespeare's words. And I have one that I copy Moby Dick. In a way, I think I've noticed that when you have a hard time, when anyone, not you or me, when anyone has a hard time, it's how time passes becomes difficult. From 1 minute to the next minute, from 1 hour to the next hour, not to mention from one day to the next, it's just abysmal, right? So I feel that just the basic thing is about eye-hand coordination. If I see a sentence and I write it down in a notebook, that takes a sentence worth of time. And then just go from there. I copy poetry and copy, Tolstoy. That's one way to deal with difficult time, is just to have something to do, to have something very concrete. And also it makes you think, especially if I copy Shakespeare, it does make me think a lot of thoughts, because he articulates thoughts in one way. It takes me, 10 times more words to articulate that thought. And that alone is a very good distraction. Just how can I do what he did?
Right. Right. And then maybe the comfort too that you're not the only one. I think literature offers us this solace. But I do this with books. I do this with podcasts sometimes, like especially if my mind isn't great, if I'm struggling or dealing with some sort of sadness or something, I'm like, well, I think I'm going to put on my headphones or pick up a book and put somebody else's thoughts in my head instead of my own, because my own aren't working very well right now.
Right. I know. And sometimes we can be, as you said, we can be brooding. We can brood, about the same thing over and over. I don't know. I feel like just change of space, as change of mental space or just physical space, is helpful.
Well, there's something very courageous about your work and about like the way that you've been able to carry on, continue doing this work so well while also dealing with all of this stuff. And I think it has to do with what we've been talking about, this willingness to really slow things down, have a look at your own mind, have a look at your own emotions, have a look at language. Like the language around grief, I think, is something that you're very concerned with.
Right.
And your work is concerned with to great effect, because these experiences of very painful loss have a tendency to leave us at a loss for words. And we all, all or most of us have a tendency to revert to these, cliched ways of talking about it. And you resist that and you examine that. I mean, I don't know how often, I don't know if you bat 1,000. Maybe you resist it some of the time, and other times you fall into it as well. It's easy to do. But these things sort of, they resist language. It's hard to get into the complexity of them. with accuracy.
Right, right. You know, sometimes I think there's a point to cliches, right? They offer everybody the comfort of saying things that they don't know what to say. They can have that framework of cliches. And of course, you know, as fiction writer, we just have to look at the framework again and say, well, this frame is really just a very stale frame. Can we find a better frame? Oftentimes, there's no better frame. But even just looking for it, I think it's worth doing.
Well, there's, I want to say, an interview that you did where you mentioned, like you were talking about something along these lines, and you, I think, were imagining in your head the first person who ever used the phrase, my heart broke. You know, and it's like, it's kind of trippy to think about, but at some point there was a person who uttered that for the first time. There, or wrote it. You know, there had to be somebody who originated it.
Right.
And it was so resonant that whoever heard it kept it for themselves, and it becomes viral, essentially. It's like a viral meme, but it's because the language is so perfect for the feeling.
Situation. Yes, yes. I think my heart broke. It's really, you know.
Can't say it much better than that.
I know. And then I thought, okay, how did it break? You know, into fragments or into pieces or into parts? You know, how does the edge feel?
and like, yeah, and like, what do you mean when you say heart? Is it like, because we know what the heart is, you know, anatomically, it's pumping blood, but when we use this word heart in this context, we're talking about something different. Something
Crystal, right? You know, fragmented. It can break. You know, our heart mostly don't break. I actually don't think heart breaks at all.
Yeah, right. So I want to speak with you about editing to achieve the effect that you achieve on the page, and I want to turn to something that I believe an editor of yours, her name is Cressida Leshan at the New Yorker.
Yes.
How you guys will talk about putting a text, quote, under anesthesia and separating it from the pain of its content. Because, you know, for readers of your work, especially readers of your work who are writers or aspiring writers, you know, I marvel at the control that you have around very delicate and difficult subject matter, especially knowing that so much of the pain that your characters are experiencing is pain that you yourself share with them, at least to some degree. And you have to achieve, I think, as a fiction writer, in order to write well, a certain remove from the material so that you can see it clearly. And yet there has to be such an emotional investment for you. So when you're working with your editor, like, can you talk about this, putting a text under anesthesia, what it actually means in practice?
Right. I think Cressida, you know, has edited 9 stories in this collection. So most of the stories are edited by Cressida, and I've been working with her for 20 years now. And I think partly when she said that, she actually said that as an apology. We were working on a nonfiction piece about my father's death and my son's death, and it was a very heavy piece. And you know, there was this joy in editing a piece. We were just going over, you know, should there be a comma here, or should we use another word there? It was such a technical, joyful discussion about the mechanism of conveying something as best as we can. And at some point, Cressida sort of stopped the discussion and apologized and said, I realize we're doing this. Well, this is your life, but, you know, editing is like putting the words under anesthesia, and we do the surgical work. She just happened to say that on my birthday, and I said, Cressida, can I always have this from you as my birthday present? She said, by all means, it's yours. So I do think about that all the time. I think that's exactly what writing is. Not only editing, writing too. As you said, you have to keep yourself at a distance and sort of just really put a little bit of anesthesia there so you can work around. You know, you can poke around with a scalpel, you know, with the blood and flesh on your hand. But you really have to do that work and separate yourself from the emotional pain, I think. Because, you know, the pain is always going to be there. It's not going, you know, how you write it or whether you write it won't change the pain, won't change the fact the pain is there. But there's always a better way to write something, and I think I just like to explore that.
Well, I mean, you said earlier you turned to writing in your grief as a way of coping, as a distraction, as a useful activity, reading and writing. And you have not shied away from writing into this stuff, like either in fiction or in nonfiction. You've written at length about these very difficult personal experiences. And I would encourage listeners who have not read this stuff to read it, because it's beautifully done. I'm curious to know what you may or may not have derived from it. Like, I get the idea that writing and reading can be a nice way to spend the time and get your mind off of things or think about it in new ways. But by writing about it so directly or indirectly, have you learned about it in ways that have you learned new things about grief and loss, for example, that have been beneficial to you and have helped you carry on more productively or helpfully? Has it brought you any relief?
I wouldn't say relief, but it's interesting, because earlier on we did talk about that word grief, right? So, and I have written my sort of argument against that word. Grief means a burden, etymology. It comes from a burden. And if you lose someone, if you lost someone, would it be a burden to you? No, you want to keep this person forever. So I sort of I have a little argument with grief, because grief is used all the time these days about. Interestingly, I do think, I've been thinking about, I guess I've just been looking at my book, and it's described as a collection about losses. And anytime you lose something, you also gain something. We forget that. You gain something different. It doesn't make up for what you've lost. But you do gain some insights, you gain some experience, or some just glimpses of human beings that you don't get to see in normal circumstance, I think. And I don't think I have found relief. I have found something. I don't know what that something is. Do you know?
I mean, maybe some deeper insight every once in a while. Maybe it's just the act of placing yourself at a remove from it. It's not dissimilar to like looking at your thoughts and watching your mind work.
Right.
But it's just maybe a more concentrated,
a
more concentrated way of doing that. And there's some relief, I think, or some insight to be gained from that process, even if the effects of it are temporary. I mean, it's not going to be some permanent salve, but it is maybe going to provide you with a little like ventilation. It's like rather than kind of living it and having it just be all up here.
Right. That's so interesting what you just said, because also we tend to, when we experience big losses, people sometimes think of you always in the frame of that loss, right? So, when we lost Winston, we went to the bank to close his bank account. The banker started to cry, and then afterwards, every time I go there, I know they look at me and say, "Oh, this is that poor woman who lost her son." But that's not my only definition. I think you have other definitions, or you have other things. I think it's the breathing space. We realize we actually have gained a lot of breathing space or at least I feel that I have gained breathing space for my mind after.
Mostly through reading and writing.
So reading and writing, yes. Yes, just working through these things.
Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about how you got to this point. Your life story is certainly unique among writers that I've spoken with. You've traveled an interesting road to get to where you are. And I feel like listeners who aren't familiar with it should hear a little bit about it, because it's pretty extraordinary. You are originally from China, and you went to Peking University. So you lived there all the way through university.
Yes.
And then immigrated to the United States to study immunology at the University of Iowa, and also to improve your English, I think.
Right, right.
So this is not a story of immigration when you were a child, like you didn't come over here with your parents as a youngster, like you grew up in China. And I believe you characterized the era in which you grew up as sort of the last generation to experience China before it became like kind of prosperous, or
right.
how we like modern China with all of its, you know, big business and everything else, right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. Yes.
So can you just describe what that means? Like, what was life like for you growing up in China, in Beijing?
Well, you know, I would call Beijing a big village, a giant village, rather than a metropolis or, you know, city. In a way, I think I grew up, I was born in early 1970s, so I grew up in during the time when everything was rationed, food, you know, clothes, shoes, everything was rationed. And so there was always a lacking of something. And really, I left China in 96. In 1995, I went to a job fair at the time. It was quite a depressing time for young people in China because there was not enough job. It was right before the boom, and every job opening had a line saying male only. Because there were enough people, there were no jobs. Why would they give job to girls? So all the jobs were for male only. That really struck me as hopeless.
So you decided to what?
I always wanted to come to America. So, but that really told me I really have to emigrate, I think. So I went to Iowa in 96. And
okay.
Yeah.
But as a child, you were a math prodigy or you were a star math student?
I was a math prodigy. I was trained as a physicist. I really had the dream when I was 10 I would become the next Madame Curie. I still thought about being Madame Curie, but I'm not going to become Madame Curie now.
But you were excellent at math.
I was excellent. I was very good.
And your father is a nuclear physicist, or was a nuclear physicist?
My father was a nuclear physicist. Every father around where I live, every father was either a mathematician or physicist. So the track on science was really made for all the smart kids, and I was put on that track. Never questioned it until I came to America.
And you had a very difficult relationship with your mother growing up, which you have spoken about.
Yeah, I have written about too.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So this is not, growing up with a nuclear physicist father, being a math prodigy, these are not the biographical details that I often hear on this show.
Really?
Mostly it's like, my parents were hippies, or I failed at math, and, the only thing I cared about was poetry, but you could you could do both, it's unusual for somebody to be both a math prodigy and an incredibly gifted writer of fiction. How did your love of literature form? And it's also pretty extraordinary to me that you are writing so beautifully in your second language. It's not unprecedented, but it definitely adds a layer of difficulty. So can you just talk about that foundation?
Well, I always loved reading as a child. The thing is, we did not have a lot of books when I grew up. So anything, I always say if I could get a piece of newspapers around a dead fish, I would peel the newspaper off the fish and I would read the newspaper from beginning to end. Because I think my love of literature probably came from that hunger. There were not enough printed words around me, So anything that was printed, I had to devour it before it became the, newspaper around the fish. So I always loved reading. And then I think in college, I went to college in Beijing. And by then I was already reading a lot of English novels, English language novels. And I felt very good about being able to understand another language. We were reading a lot of, what was available in China. For instance, Jack London. I read, the whole body work of Jack London because he was communist. So his work was available in China.
So, like, what was available in a literary sense was very controlled.
Very controlled, limited, very limited. When I went to Army. I went to Chinese Army for a year. When I was in the Army, someone, the girl next to me, she got a copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover, which was banned in China.
I think it was banned in the States at some point.
It was banned everywhere,
yeah.
I think. But she didn't want to read the English book. I mean, her English was not very good, but she wanted to know how people have sex mid-love. So she assigned me to read a book for her. I mean, we were 18. Neither of us knew how to have sex with a man. But she assigned me to read the book and marked all the love-making scenes for her, so she could just, read those passages.
The Cliff's Notes, I think we would call that. The
Cliff's Notes of Lady Chatterley's Lover. It was quite an amazing experience. It didn't make me love the book, because it was quite disorienting, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and you could get in trouble if you get caught with that. I mean, not only from your parents, but I mean, is there some sort of danger to you if you get caught with like a book that is not approved by the state?
I think we heavily wrapped it up with other books' cover. So it had a different cover while we were reading it. Inside was Lady Chatterley's Lover. So.
And a lot of the books we should note that you grew up on and were really influenced by were by the Russians. So the Russians were permitted,
yes,
for reasons that would make sense.
Exactly. So Russian, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Chekhov, these were my, childhood bread and butter.
And to some degree still are. I mean, you name-checked Tolstoy earlier in this conversation. And you still read War and Peace once a year?
I do. I just finished it this year.
Oh, you did? Okay. We're going to get to your reading, which I think is interesting. But that's a big book to read on an annual basis, and you get something new from it every time.
Every time I see new things, and it turned out it's not a big book enough to read every year. You just read faster and faster.
Yeah, well, certain parts of it you sort of know, right? Mm-hmm. So you can skim a little bit. But I want to talk to you a little bit more about this issue of learning English as a young girl and a young woman growing up in China, and having it become not only something that you felt a sense of pride about, like being able to understand a second language, but also as a increasingly, I would imagine, as a refuge, mm-hmm, as a kind of you've described it as a private salvation, right, because your mother, right, didn't speak English. It was, mm-hmm, a way for you to sort of communicate in a manner that was yours and yours alone.
Right.
And I think too, there were moments in your adolescence where your gift for writing was made apparent, and it had to do with, what was it, like writing propaganda, essentially, yes, and these kind of passages that were cliched and aggrandized the state, and you would perform these. Like
in a refreshing way.
Yeah, you would get up and recite these in front of people, and they were sort of laced with half-truths and cliches, mm-hmm, and stuff, and you didn't really trust what you were saying. And yet, the response that you were receiving from your audience was great emotion. Yeah. People were buying every word.
Right. Yeah.
And you said, I want to say, I think that was the end of my relationship with Chinese. I know China is beautiful. I love its poetry. But the moment I speak, I always think of that day that I moved people to tears.
I moved myself to tears.
But that experience really marked you.
Yes. When you were 17, I was 17, and I went on to give the most beautiful, piece about loving your country, loving your motherland, that kind of language. I would say it was probably one of the most remarkable experiences, just to make me look at myself again. Because earlier you said something very important. You said not to take something too seriously. And I think that's the moment I realized you cannot take language too seriously, because language can be deceiving if used in a certain way. You can deceive people. You can make people, cry, but it's all lies. I still think about that moment. I think it's a career-defining moment. You cannot use cliche, especially if you can use cliche in a very clever way. People will be led or misled, and that's the danger of that kind of propaganda. I did when I was in the army. My squad leader said we have to write a propaganda piece once a week, and because I was so good at it, and she always assigned me to write it. And I said, I don't want to write. I said, we should take turns. And she said, no. She said, either you write it or you clean the toilet. I did not want to clean the toilet.
Understandable.
So I kept writing these things, but it made me think about what I could do, but I would never want to do. One thing I would never do is to write in Chinese.
You were going to write in English.
I'm just going to use a different language. A language, at least, for me, I did not grow up with English. I did not grow up with the old cliches. Well, I did not grow up with propaganda. So I want the language to be a little purer. And then you cannot say just pure, but a little purer. A little pure,
yeah. Well, and I have to say, not to get off onto a political tangent, but I have to believe for somebody with your set of experiences in youth to bear witness to the last several years in the United States, you have to bring a more informed perspective to what we've been going through here, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, people use words they don't without thinking about them. That's really upsetting, right? If someone says something, another person repeats that, and then it becomes truth. When we were in China, we had this saying, if a lie is repeated 1,000 times, it becomes truth. Nowadays, you repeat the lies 3 times, it's truth now.
Well, that and the velocity, I think, has increased exponentially with social media.
Very much so.
So the dissemination of propaganda, that's been one of the lessons for me. It's just the ways in which misinformation and disinformation, propaganda can move through a culture really, really quickly. And the depth of impact is, I got to admit, something that surprised me. Having not lived through it before at that degree of intensity. This stuff is never absent from any culture or any political system, but the last several years have been particularly intense in the United States, and it's been an unpleasant education.
It's eye-opening.
But maybe not as much for you.
Still, it's upsetting.
Yeah. And there's a story. There's a couple stories, I think, the references, but I'm thinking of the one in particular with the women who are married to men who have different politics than they do. I'll let listeners get to it, but you do address some of this stuff in your collection.
Right. As I say, life bleeds in, politics bleeds in too. 2016's election. There's one moment someone said to me, because we lived in the Bay Area at the time, the certain percentage voted for Trump, but there was 2 kids. What the mother said, don't tell your classmates your dad voted for Trump. And the kid said, Mom, we're not idiots.
In the Bay Area, that's you can lose your street cred if you start telling people that.
Right. So these kids were 8. They knew not to talk about their father's politics. So.
And that's reflected in this story.
Mm-hmm.
So you get to just to follow your your biographical line a little bit further. You leave China and come to the United States to study immunology at the University of Iowa.
Right.
Why the University of Iowa?
I don't know. I looked at map, and I was in China. I got accepted by 4 schools, including University of Iowa. I knew nothing about any of the 4 schools. So I just randomly picked Iowa because Iowa has a lot of pigs, according to the map I was looking at.
Has a lot of pigs. So you figured there would be food?
I don't know why. Well, I don't know. It just tickled me. It said this is the state that has more pigs than any other state. I thought, okay, go to Iowa. It was a very random decision. That's what I meant to say. Sometimes I think especially nowadays, we want as much information as possible to make a good decision, right? Sometimes a decision was just made blindly,
But fatefully too.
Yes.
Because you just so happened to go to the university that has the one of, if not the finest graduate creative writing programs and literary networks in the country. So,
well, my husband said I was the luckiest person in the world. He said, if you go to a city where everybody's a firefighter, you end up being a firefighter. So I did go to a city where, when I was in Iowa, someone told me everybody in Iowa City is writing a novel. So everybody is writing a novel in Iowa City.
Including you, eventually.
Including me, yes, and I became one of those people.
So you're studying immunology, and then you become professional, no? Or you're always in school the whole time that you're there?
I worked in a hospital. I worked in a VA hospital in Iowa for over a year before I became a writer. So
talk about this transition. Like, when did you admit it to yourself? You know, like, when do you start to actually put pen to paper and start keeping these notebooks and start thinking, like, I want to try this?
Well, the second year I was in America, I mean, as I said, someone told me everybody in Iowa City is writing a novel. That's sort of illuminating. I just thought maybe I would try too. So I started to try a little. I knew I wasn't good. You know, I couldn't even write good English at the time. You just keep, like, I kept a secret sort of second hobby of writing. You know, I would tell people my hobby was writing. It was not a hobby. It was something I wanted to pursue. And I was in a PhD program, and I passed my qualification, and I was nearly done with my research. And I realized if I finished research, I would have to become Dr. Li. And I didn't want to be called Dr. Li because I didn't want to work on immunology anymore. So I told my PI, I said, actually, I wanted to be a writer. He was a little sad.
I mean,
he was supportive and sad.
It's a bit less of a certain path, I think.
That's exactly
writing
right.
As compared to medicine.
Yes.
But it worked out.
Well, he said, you're so good with your research. No doubt you will find a job teaching or, you know, in an American university. Why giving it up? And why giving up? I don't know. Just had to.
You had to. So what do? You start, I mean, and how, at what point do you become aware of the Iowa Writers Workshop and like interacting with people there?
I didn't interact with people there, but I gave up science in 2000s, and it took me a couple years to get into the program. So I was just working and writing on my own.
Learning.
I think just learning by... I remember at one time I went to Prairie Lights, this lovely bookstore in Iowa City. I wasn't a great writer at the time, but I picked up the book. The book wasn't that well written, I would say. And I read a few lines. I thought, oh my God, I could do better than this.
Which book was it?
Don't know, don't remember, but I remember the thought, surely I could do better than this. And then that's just, you know, from there, I just thought I would just want to do better.
Mm. You know, it strikes me, there's something that I see in a lot of reviews of your work is the word like precision, accuracy, elegance. You know, there's a real control on the page that's very evident. And I can't help but wonder if it has something to do with the fact that you're writing in a second language. And like you've talked earlier, you know, you don't like that this word grief is problematic for you. There are other words that you like, kind of refuse to use in your fiction, like words like always, never. Like you have, right. There are words that are problematic. And I feel like, you know, we all have these, writers all have, you know, we all have our little relationships with particular words. But I think for somebody who is coming at English as a second language, you might have an attention to it, an attention to maybe etymology that a native speaker might not, because it's so second nature. It's just something that we've been raised with. You know, your native tongue is your native tongue, and your second language is something that you've really had to study and that is still in some sense foreign. It's always going to be, right? I mean, even though you may dream in English now, I don't know how prominent it is in your psyche, but you know, but
right. I do dream in English. I sort of curse in English. the one thing that I don't have with English is the intimacy with the language. A native speaker, you grew up listening to the language when you were not speaking. You were listening. The language is saturated, a child's life. I did not have that experience, so I don't feel I have the intimacy with English. In exchange, I do put a lot of pressure on knowing every word I use. I look up every word in the dictionary, even though as the second nature some of the words. Nobody would look up in a dictionary. I would look up in a dictionary. I would understand where they came from, etymologically wise, is there a better way to say it? Is there a new way to use the same word? So I do put a lot of pressure on the language.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That somebody who would have such a careful and attentive relationship with the language would be somebody who's often had to pick up the dictionary and actually look at the word on the page and read the definition and think about it, and then maybe look at the little etymological explanation that might accompany the definition. And that's a good education. And for somebody who is really gifted with language, I've had this experience before, reading books by people or listening even to people who are giving a speech in in English as their second or third language or whatever it is, that there's something about the limitations of their intimacy or even their understanding of the language. They might be limited in word choice, but that will make them careful, and there's a clarity to it that I think actually exceeds a native speaker in a strange way. But it takes somebody, I think, who's really gifted with language. Limitation is not going to automatically produce clarity, is the point.
That's true.
It's got to be like limitation plus careful attention.
Careful, yeah. I think I like what you said, the careful attention. I do think, if I have one thing that I can be proud of, it's just the attention I pay to everything. I just pay close attention to a lot of things.
Yeah. It shows up on the page. It's effortless to read, which is usually a good sign. It goes down. I always say easy reading is hard writing. Like if somebody's work is a pleasure to read, and it's not that it doesn't have it. It's not that it isn't challenging. Like it has plenty of challenges. I think a lot of the challenges of your work have to do with the emotional acuity, and like dealing with that interiority and the real lived-in, recognizable aspects of these kinds of darker corners of the human psyche that we all have, but that we don't all look at so closely. And so that's where I found myself having to sort of stop, look up. And that's beautiful, though. We need that, I think, as people and as readers. And it's noble of you to do all of that on behalf of the reader. Like, I certainly appreciate it. And, I'm going to skip over some stuff in the interest of time with respect to your publication history and your career trajectory. I think the short version is that your debut did well, at coming out of Iowa and sort of launched you and has set you on your course, and you've continued to publish. And, we started this conversation close to the top by talking about the losses that you have suffered over the course of the past 14 years as you've accumulated the stories that appear in this collection. But one of the things that we did not touch upon, which you've also had to live through, is going through a difficult mental health crisis yourself in the summer of 2012, where you twice tried to take your own life. And I believe that this crisis is attributable to medication, going off of medication.
Yeah, part of it, it's just biochemistry.
Yeah.
Plus a lot of, difficult things in life, plus biochemistry. Yeah. And
to work through that, the same sort of regimen or the same sort of practice that has helped you work through loss, books, reading, writing. I want to say I read that in the aftermath, once you had been kind of gotten on stabler ground, you couldn't really write, but you could read.
Right. I think for a year I didn't write fiction at all. I was mostly just reading people's diaries and journals and letters. In a way, just to know if you read Chekhov's diary, Chekhov's journal or letters, or if you read Catherine Mansfield's journals, you realize what you experienced. These people, these writers before you, they all had a similar version of that. And they either lived through or they did not survive. Some of them did not survive. It's just a way, I think earlier you said something, you're not alone in this. Anytime I look at my life, I'm not the only parent who has lost a child. I'm not the only writer who has had a mental breakdown. I'm not alone in this. People work through these things. So for a year I didn't write much. I read a lot, and I that saved my life, I think, or saved my mental, space.
There's I believe it's a line from Catherine Mansfield that you later used as the title for one of your books, and it's long, and I'm going to botch it. It's like, "Dear friend."
It's called "Dear Friend, from my life, I write to you in your life."
There you go. That's
that
lovely. That
just summarizes everything about our writer's life, right?
Yeah, it does. But it's also, I think there's something really generous in that line, and it's the kind of line that I think you could only latch onto when you're on the other side of the difficulty that you went through. It's not a line that you could maybe use, at least not with confidence, when you're in the middle of it. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
I want to talk to you about your reading practice. I want to say somebody asked you this, and it struck me. I think they asked you how you spend your days. And you were like, well, I go to you're a creature of habit. Is that fair to say?
Very, very much so, yes.
As am I, and as are, I would argue, probably 99% of writers. I don't think you can be a writer without being a creature of habit, and there are many reasons for that, but I just think it's necessary to get the work done, and maybe it's just something temperamental, but you have said you go to the office and teach, you might swim in the on-campus pool, and you read 5 to 10 hours a day, and you write on some days.
That's about right.
5 to 10 hours a day of reading.
That's not there are 24 hours a day.
True.
You sleep for 8 hours, and you have meals 2 hours. What else?
So you read, you must read. How many books a year are you reading? Do you know? Do you keep track?
I don't keep track because I would say any moment I read between 5 and 10 books any day. So, which means I actually don't read a book for 5 hours. I read one book for half an hour. I switch to another book for another half hour, and I may read a book for an hour. But I have to read all the books I've been reading. If there are 10 books, I have to read through 10 books. That takes at least 5, 6, 7 hours a day.
Wow. And so, and you're reading in short snippets, like 10 or 15, 20 pages.
Yes, I read
book.
that. Yeah.
And then you move to the next.
Yeah. I have this thought. A writer spends a long time writing a book. If I were the writer, I wouldn't want people to finish the book in 2 hours. I want them to spend, 15 minutes today, an hour tomorrow, just to live with the book.
Savor my words.
Yes.
Just savor.
Yeah. So I think the books I read, I always spend at least 2-3 weeks with them, each of them.
And then you're teaching and reading your students' work too, I would imagine. So that's also reading.
Yes, and then I write a little.
What does that mean? I write a little. So you don't write. You don't write every day, but you might write a couple hours a day when it's going well.
When it goes well, I try to write a couple hours a day. Yes.
Every day.
Almost every day. I can't say every day. I don't think I can live up to that standard.
Yeah, you and me both, especially lately. I've been so busy, but I always ask people at the end if they are working on anything else. I have to believe somebody who's reading 5 and 10 books at a time is working on multiple books at a time, though maybe I'm wrong.
Well, in the past, I always work on a long project, and I work on a short story, which is how this collection, Wednesday's Child, came to be, because it's over the years I've written all those novels while on the side I'm writing short stories. I haven't written a new short story because I'm in the middle of very long project.
A novel.
A novel, maybe a set of novels.
Mm. Any hints as to what it involves?
It involves history.
Now it's becoming clear. Let's see.
It involves, I mean, I can give you the time frame. It's 1780 to 1840.
Oh, okay. So this is like real historical fiction.
Long, very long. So it covers 3 continents.
Wow.
So
a lot of research, I would imagine.
Yeah, I'm doing research, doing a lot of reading, and doing some writing. So I can't say more because it's at the beginning.
Yeah. Okay. So you're not very far into it, or?
A few months into it.
A few months. Okay. But for a project as long as the one that you seem to be describing, you've got a ways to go.
Yes. It's a marathon. I'm just at mile 2, I think.
Mm. Well, you, as I said, have been through quite a lot, and you have found a way to continue to do this work and to look at this stuff, this difficult stuff, in ways that I think are really beautiful and difficult, but ultimately really beneficial to readers. So I commend you for that. I'm so sorry for your losses. I'm so sorry, and I certainly wish you well. I'm wondering if like a last question, like, do you ever have a moment where you think about your life, from China to here, all of it, and you think to yourself, like, what's the point? Like, why me? Do you know what I'm saying? Why is, like, what? I mean, I think we all have maybe these moments. I certainly do. Like, what is life trying to tell me? What does life want from me? Do you know what I'm saying? Because I keep having to endure. Like, I have somehow been selected by fate to have to go through X, Y, and Z. A lot of loss in your life. And I'm just wondering if do you have any way to make sense of it? Or is it?
I don't. I think part of writing actually is just to put that energy into writing other people's stories instead of making sense of my own life. I think I've given up on that.
But yeah, I guess that's a good place to end. I'm now thinking of, there's an anecdote that I'm thinking of that I have to bring up because it's very beautiful and it kind of resonates with what you just said. But it has to do with something Marilyn Robinson said to you after your son had died, where she said, I think he had a very profound experience of life. And profound is another one of these words that you have some resistance to. Right. Because, like, what does it mean? Right. And yet, in that usage, it became clear to you. It was a good usage in your view. Right. I feel like the same could be said of you yourself. Like, you're having a profound, however difficult it may be, from the outside looking in, you've had quite a profound experience of life. Well, I thank you very much. I don't know what to say to that. I just have to say thank you. Okay. Well, it's been lovely to speak with you. I appreciate it. Congratulations on Wednesday's Child. It is truly a superb collection. Thank you so very much for having me.